The rain came down in sheets so thick that Petra Ashford could barely see 3 feet in front of her face, and when the faint orange glow of forge light appeared through the deluge like a beacon, she ran toward it without thinking. Her boots splashed through mud that threatened to suck them off her feet, her travel pack growing heavier with every step as the fabric absorbed water like a sponge. She had been walking for 2 days straight, keeping to the forest roads that connected the scattered frontier settlements, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the Orc clan that had exiled her for the unforgivable crime of mercy. The building that housed the forge was larger than she expected, a sturdy structure of stone and timber with a wide opening where the heat and light spilled out into the storm. Petra hesitated at the threshold, her hand gripping the rough wooden frame as she peered inside. A human man stood at the anvil, his back to her, hammer raised high before he brought it down with a resounding clang that echoed even over the drumming rain. His shoulders were broad beneath a leather apron darkened with soot and sweat, his sandy brown hair tied back from his face with a strip of cloth. She knew she should announce herself, should ask permission before entering, but the cold had seeped so deep into her bones that her teeth were chattering, and the warmth radiating from the forge pulled at her like a physical force. Petra took one step inside, then another, water streaming from her clothes to pool on the stone floor. The man must have sensed her presence because he turned sharply, hammer still in hand, and his gray eyes widened when he saw her. Petra watched the familiar progression of emotions cross his face in the space of heartbeat's surprise, recognition of what she was, fear, calculation. She raised her hands slowly, showing him her empty palms, the universal gesture of peace that meant the same thing whether you had green skin and tusks or not. "I mean no harm," she said, hating how her voice shook from the cold. "I only seek shelter from the storm. I will leave as soon as it passes." The man did not lower his hammer, but neither did he raise an alarm or reach for the sword that hung on the wall within easy reach. He studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, taking in her soaked clothing, the pack that hung from her shoulders, the exhaustion that must have been written clearly across her features. His gaze lingered on her tusks, small though they were compared to the males of her kind, and on the pointed tips of her ears that marked her as something other than human. "You are far from Orc territory," he said finally. His voice was deep and measured, neither welcoming nor hostile. "I am no longer welcome in Orc territory," Petra replied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. She had not meant to reveal so much so quickly, but the cold and fatigue had loosened her usual caution. Something shifted in the man's expression, a slight softening around his eyes. He lowered the hammer at last, setting it on the anvil with deliberate care. "You are exiled." It was not a question, but Petra nodded anyway. 3 days ago, I have been walking since." The man was silent for a long moment, and Petra could see him weighing his options. Giving shelter to an Orc, even an exiled one, would not earn him any favors with his neighbors. If word got out, he might face suspicion or worse. But she could also see the moment he made his decision, saw it in the set of his jaw and the way his shoulders relaxed fractionally. "My name is Quentin Yardley," he said. "This is my forge. You may stay until the storm passes, and you may warm yourself by the fire. There is a storeroom in the back with some old blankets. You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." The kindness in his offer hit Petra with unexpected force, and she felt her throat tighten with emotion she could not afford to show. "Thank you," she managed. "I am Petra Ashford." Quentin nodded once, then turned back to his work as if having an Orc woman dripping water onto his floor was the most natural thing in the world. Petra stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to do, before the cold finally drove her into motion. She found the storeroom exactly where Quentin had indicated, a small space lined with shelves that held ingots of metal, leather straps, wooden handles, and other supplies for the smith's trade. A pile of blankets sat folded in one corner, and though they were rough wool and smelled faintly of smoke, they were blessedly dry. She stripped out of her wet tunic and leggings with fingers that barely cooperated, her skin mottled with cold. The blanket she wrapped around herself was scratchy against her bare shoulders, but the warmth it trapped made her sigh with relief. She spread her wet clothes over an empty shelf to dry, then returned to the main room of the forge. Quentin was working a piece of metal in the fire, using tongs to turn it until it glowed the right shade of orange. He did not look up when she approached, but she saw his awareness of her in the slight tilt of his head. Petra moved closer to the forge, drawn by its heat, and stood watching him work in silence. The rhythm of smithing was familiar to her. Her clan had their own forge, and she had spent countless hours there as a young girl, watching the smith shape metal into tools and weapons. There was something meditative about the way the hammer strikes followed a pattern as old as civilization itself, about the transformation of raw ore into something useful and beautiful. Quentin pulled the metal from the fire and carried it to the anvil, and Petra saw that he was making a horseshoe. His hammer blows were precise and practiced, each one shaping the curve exactly as it needed to be. But she also noticed the way his breathing had changed, coming faster and harder than the work warranted. The forge was hot, yes, but not so hot that it should leave him laboring for air. "You need someone on the bellows," she said before she could think better of it. Quentin paused mid-strike and glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "The boy who usually helps me is sick with fever. I have been managing on my own." "You are losing heat," Petra observed, nodding toward the fire. "The metal will not hold the proper temperature if the forge is not hot enough." For a moment she thought he would refuse, would tell her that he did not need help from an orc, that he would rather work twice as hard than accept her assistance. But then he set down his hammer and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of soot across his skin. "Do you know how to work a bellows?" he asked. "I do," Petra said. "My clan smith taught me when I was young. He said that good smithing required good breath, and the bellows were the forge's lungs." The corner of Quentin's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Your clan smith was a wise man. Very well, if you are offering your help, I will not turn it down. The bellows are there." He pointed to the large leather apparatus that sat beside the forge. Petra moved to the bellows with a sense of purpose that felt almost foreign after days of aimless wandering. She positioned herself and tested the mechanism, getting a feel for its weight and resistance. When Quentin returned the horseshoe to the fire, she began to pump, watching the coals glow brighter and hotter with each squeeze. They fell into a rhythm without needing to speak, Petra keeping the fire at the right temperature while Quentin worked the metal. She could see the difference it made immediately. The horseshoe took shape faster and more smoothly, and Quentin's breathing eased as he no longer had to constantly interrupt his work to pump the bellows himself. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the forge it felt like its own world, separated from everything else by walls of stone and heat, and the steady clang of hammer on anvil. Petra lost track of time as they worked, her arms falling into the steady pump and release of the bellows, her eyes drawn again and again to Quentin's profile as he bent over his work. He was handsome in a rough, practical way, she realized. Not the kind of handsome that turned heads in a crowd, but the kind that grew on you slowly, that revealed itself in the competent way he handled his tools and the quiet confidence in his movements. There were lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, though his expression now was one of concentration. When he finally set aside the finished horseshoe to cool, he turned to Petra with something that was definitely a smile this time. "You have a steady hand on those bellows. My apprentice tends to get overeager and pump too hard, then too soft. You maintained an even temperature throughout." The praise warmed Petra more than the forge had, and she felt her tusks scrape against her lower lip as she returned the smile. "Thank you. It has been a long time since I worked in a forge. I had forgotten how much I enjoyed it." Quentin walked to a barrel in the corner and ladled water from it into 2 tin cups. He brought one to Petra, and she accepted it gratefully, her throat parched from the heat. The water was cool and sweet, and she drank deeply before meeting his eyes. "Why were you exiled?" he asked quietly. "If you do not mind my asking." Petra had known the question was coming, had felt it hovering between them since she first admitted her status. She could have refused to answer, could have told him it was not his business. But he had given her shelter when he did not have to, had accepted her help without suspicion or scorn, and she felt she owed him the truth. "There was a human child," she began, the memory rising sharp and clear in her mind. "A girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She wandered into our territory, lost and crying. She must have become separated from her family somehow. I found her by the river, and I knew that if any of the males found her first, they would kill her. Humans and orcs do not have peace between them in that region. So I hid her, and when night fell, I carried her back to the edge of human lands and left her where she would be found safely." She paused, swirling the water in her cup. "But one of the hunters saw me. He reported what I had done to the clan chief. They said I had betrayed my people, that I had shown weakness and mercy to those who would show us none. The punishment for such betrayal is exile. So here I am." Quentin was quiet for a long time, his gray eyes searching her face. "You saved a child's life," he said finally. "That is not betrayal, that is honor." Petra felt something crack inside her chest. Some tight knot of pain and anger that had been lodged there since the moment the clan chief pronounced her exile. She had told herself that she made the right choice, that she would do it again even knowing the cost. But she had not truly believed it until this moment, until a human stranger spoke the words she needed to hear. "Thank you," she whispered, and she had to look away before the tears that threatened to spill could betray her. The storm showed no signs of letting up as darkness fell outside. Quentin banked the forge fire and covered it, then moved around the space with the ease of long familiarity, tidying tools and sweeping the floor. Petra watched him, still wrapped in her blanket, still waiting for him to tell her it was time to leave despite the weather. Instead, he said, "You should stay the night. The storm will likely continue until morning, and there is nowhere safe for you to go in the dark even if it were clear." "I do not wish to impose," Petra said, though the thought of going back out into the cold rain made her want to weep. "You are not imposing. I have a small room upstairs where I sleep. There is another room, barely more than a closet really, but it has a pallet and it is dry. You are welcome to it." Petra nodded, not trusting her voice. Quentin led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor of the building, where 2 doors faced each other across a small landing. He opened one to reveal exactly what he had described: a tiny space with a straw pallet, a single blanket, and a shuttered window. To Petra, who had spent the last 2 nights sleeping rough in the forest, it looked like luxury. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Quentin nodded, already turning toward his own room. "Sleep well, Petra Ashford. We will talk more in the morning." Petra lay down on the pallet, still wrapped in the wool blanket from the storeroom, her damp clothes spread out in the hopes they would finish drying overnight. She was exhausted down to her bones, but sleep did not come immediately. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain drum against the shutters, thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been part of a clan, had belonged somewhere even if that belonging came with rules and expectations that chafed. Now she was adrift, with no destination and no plan beyond surviving each day as it came. And yet, lying in this small room above a human's forge, listening to the quiet sounds of Quentin moving around in the room across the landing, she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt safe. Morning came gray and sullen, the rain reduced to a steady drizzle that looked like it might continue indefinitely. Petra woke to the sound of movement downstairs and the smell of wood smoke. Her clothes were still slightly damp, but dry enough to wear, and she dressed quickly before making her way down to the forge. Quentin was already at work, building up the fire in preparation for the day. He looked up when she appeared and offered her a brief nod of greeting. "There is bread and cheese on the workbench if you are hungry. Help yourself." Petra found the simple breakfast waiting exactly where he said, wrapped in clean cloth. Her stomach growled at the sight of it, reminding her that she had eaten nothing but foraged berries and stream water for the past 3 days. She forced herself to eat slowly, to savor each bite rather than wolfing it down like the starving creature she felt like. "What will you do now?" Quentin asked, his back to her as he worked. "Where will you go?" It was the question Petra had been avoiding asking herself. "I do not know," she admitted. "South, perhaps. I have heard there are settlements on the southern frontier where humans and orcs sometimes trade, where the old hatreds are not so strong. Maybe I could find a place there." "That is a long journey," Quentin observed. "At least 2 weeks on foot, longer if you must avoid the main roads." "I have nowhere else to be," Petra said with a shrug she did not quite feel. Quentin set down the poker he had been using to arrange the coals and turned to face her fully. There was an expression on his face that she could not quite read, something thoughtful and hesitant. "Or," he said slowly, "you could stay here." Petra stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Stay? My apprentice has been sick for nearly a week now, and from what his mother tells me, he may be sick for a week more. The fever is bad this season, hitting half the settlement. I have orders to fill and work that cannot wait. You proved yesterday that you know your way around a forge. If you were willing to work the bellows and help with some of the simpler tasks, I could pay you in room and board and a small wage besides." Hope and caution warred in Petra's chest. "The humans in this settlement will not take kindly to having an orc in their midst," she said carefully. "The forge is on the edge of the settlement, and most people do not come here. They leave their orders, and I deliver the finished work to them. As long as you stay close to the building, you should not encounter much trouble, and even if you do—" He paused, his jaw setting in a stubborn line. "Even if you do, this is my forge and my business. I will hire who I choose." Petra wanted to say yes so badly it hurt. She wanted to stay in this warm space, to work beside this unexpected ally, to postpone for just a little while longer the daunting journey south. But she also knew what it would cost him if his neighbors turned against him, knew that he was offering more than he should for the sake of a stranger. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Quentin was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "My father was a blacksmith and his father before him. When I was learning the trade, my father told me that a forge is a sacred place in its own way. It is where raw ore becomes tools that plant crops, shoes that carry horses, nails that build homes. A forge is about transformation and creation, and no good smith turns away honest help or refuses to see the potential in what others discard as worthless." He gestured toward her with one calloused hand. Your people cast you out for doing what was right. That does not make you worthless, Petra Ashford. That makes them fools. So yes, I am offering you work, and I am doing it because I need the help and because I think you will do good work. The rest of it, what the neighbors think, what judgment they might pass, that is my burden to carry, not yours. Petra felt the tears she had held back the night before threaten again, and this time she did not try to stop them. They traced hot paths down her cheeks as she nodded, her voice rough when she finally managed to speak. Then yes, I will stay and I will work and I will do my best to prove your faith in me well-founded. Quentin's smile was small but genuine. Good. Then let us get to work. Those horseshoes will not forge themselves. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Petra found deeply comforting. She would rise with the sun and help Quentin build up the forge fire, then spend the morning working the bellows while he shaped metal into the endless stream of items that frontier life required: horseshoes and nails, hinges and handles, cooking pots and door latches. In the afternoon, when Quentin needed to focus on more delicate work or meet with customers, Petra would take on the simpler tasks he set for her: sorting scrap metal, preparing stock for the next day's work, maintaining the tools and equipment. She learned quickly that Quentin was a man of few words but deep kindness. He did not pry into her past beyond what she had already shared, did not ask questions that might cause pain. Instead, he taught her things, showed her the difference between iron that was ready to work and iron that needed more time in the fire, explained the properties of different metals and how they responded to heat and hammering, let her try her hand at simple projects under his patient guidance. And in return, Petra found herself opening up in small ways, sharing stories of her childhood in the clan, of the vast forests and swift rivers of Orc territory, of the traditions and customs that had shaped her understanding of the world. Quentin listened with genuine interest, sometimes asking questions that showed he was truly absorbing what she said rather than simply being polite. The settlement residents were, as Petra had predicted, less than thrilled to discover an Orc working at the forge. The first confrontation came on the fourth day, when a farmer named Gideon arrived to collect a set of repaired tools and caught sight of Petra carrying an armload of wood to feed the forge. "What in blazes is that creature doing here?" he demanded, his weathered face going red with outrage. Petra froze, the wood clutched to her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run or fight. But Quentin stepped smoothly between her and the angry farmer, his expression calm but his posture making it clear he would not back down. "That is my assistant, and she is doing the work I hired her to do," Quentin said evenly. "Your tools are finished and waiting on the bench by the door." Gideon sputtered, his eyes darting between Quentin and Petra. "You hired an Orc. Have you lost your senses, Yardley? Those things are savages, monsters. She will slit your throat in your sleep and steal everything you own." "She has been working here for 4 days," Quentin replied, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "In that time, my throat remains unslit, my property remains unstolen, and I have gotten more work done than I have in the week prior. Now, would you like your tools, or would you like to stand here insulting my assistant?" The farmer grabbed his tools with an angry grunt and stalked off, but Petra could see him glancing back over his shoulder, his expression promising that this was not over. She set down the wood with hands that trembled slightly and met Quentin's eyes. "That will not be the last time," she said quietly. "I know," Quentin agreed, "but they will get used to it or they will not. Either way, you are staying." But the confrontations did not stop. Over the next week, 3 more customers voiced their displeasure, one with enough volume that half the settlement probably heard him. Petra noticed that some of the regular customers stopped coming by, choosing to have their work done by the blacksmith in the next settlement over rather than patronize a forge that employed an orc. She saw the toll it took on Quentin, saw the tightness around his eyes when another order was canceled, saw the way he counted and recounted the coins in his strongbox. She knew she should leave, should spare him the consequences of his kindness. But every time she worked up the courage to tell him she was going, he would do something: share his lunch with her, show her a new technique, tell her a story from his own past that made her want to stay just a little longer. And beneath all of it, beneath the daily rhythm of work and the slow erosion of Quentin's customer base, Petra was aware of something else growing between them. She caught herself watching him when she should have been focused on her work, admiring the play of muscles in his forearms as he hammered, the concentration on his face when he examined a piece for flaws, the rare smile that transformed his usually serious expression. She saw the way he looked at her sometimes too, when he thought she was not paying attention, his gray eyes soft with something she did not dare name. Once, their hands brushed when they both reached for the same tool, and the contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the heat of the forge. They both pulled back quickly, awkwardness hanging between them, but Petra could not stop thinking about that brief touch for the rest of the day. The turning point came on a cool evening 2 weeks after Petra had first stumbled into the forge. Quentin's apprentice, a boy named Thomas, had finally recovered from his illness and come by to resume his work. He was a gangly youth of 15 with sandy hair like Quentin's and a friendly, open face. Petra had been prepared for him to react to her presence with the same hostility most of the settlement had shown, but instead he looked at her with open curiosity. "So you are the orc assistant," he said, looking her up and down without any apparent fear. "Master Quentin says you are better on the Bellows than I ever was. I suppose that is not saying much. He has been trying to teach me rhythm for 2 years now without much success." Petra blinked, caught off guard by his casual acceptance. Yes, I have been helping while you were ill." Thomas grinned, an expression that made him look even younger. "Well, I am better now, so I suppose you will be leaving. Master Quentin must be glad to have his real apprentice back instead of making do with temporary help." Something in Petra's chest seized at the thought of leaving, but before she could formulate a response, Quentin spoke from where he stood by the anvil. "Actually, Thomas, I was hoping Petra would stay on. There is enough work for 3 hands, especially with the spring orders coming in. You could focus on learning the finishing work while Petra continues with the bellows and preparation." Thomas shrugged agreeably. "Fine by me. It will be nice to have someone else to talk to during the long days. Master Quentin is a good teacher, but he is not much for conversation." Quentin made a gruff sound that might have been amusement. "I talk plenty. I simply do not fill every silence with chatter the way you do." Over the following days, the 3 of them settled into a new rhythm. Thomas proved to be as talkative as Quentin had implied, full of gossip about the settlement and stories about his large family. He seemed completely unbothered by Petra's presence, treating her with the same casual friendliness he showed Quentin. His easy acceptance was a balm to Petra's bruised spirit, a reminder that not all humans saw her as a monster. But his presence also meant that Petra and Quentin had fewer opportunities for the quiet conversations they had fallen into when it was just the 2 of them. She found herself missing those moments, missing the feeling of Quentin's full attention on her, missing the small smiles he would give her when she successfully completed a task he had set. She told herself it was foolish to feel this way, that any attachment to Quentin was doomed from the start. He was human, she was orc, and the world had made it abundantly clear that such a gulf could not be bridged. But knowing something intellectually and getting her heart to accept it were two different things entirely. The crisis came on a market day, when the settlement square was full of people buying and selling goods, catching up on gossip, and generally enjoying the brief respite from their labors. Quentin had finished a large order of nails for the carpenter and needed to deliver them personally to settle the account. Petra had stayed behind at the forge, as she always did on market days, keeping herself out of sight to avoid causing trouble. But Thomas had forgotten his lunch, and when Quentin saw the wrapped bundle sitting on the bench, he asked Petra if she would mind running it to the boy. The market square was only a short walk, and Thomas would be hungry without his meal. Petra hesitated, but Quentin's expression was so hopeful, so trusting that she found herself nodding. She kept to the edge of the square, her hood pulled up to shadow her features, scanning the crowd for Thomas's sandy hair. She spotted him standing by the produce stalls, laughing with a girl his own age, and she started toward him with the bundle held in front of her like a shield. She had made it halfway across the square when someone bumped into her hard enough to knock her hood back. There was a moment of stunned silence as the people nearby registered what she was, and then the shouting began. "Orc! Monster in the market! Someone get the militia!" Petra backed away slowly, her hands raised in a placating gesture, but the crowd was already surging toward her with hostility writ large on their faces. She saw Thomas pushing through the throng, his young face pale with alarm, but he was too far away to reach her before the first stone flew. It caught her on the shoulder, a sharp burst of pain that made her stagger. Another stone followed, then another, and Petra turned to run even as she knew it was hopeless. The crowd was between her and the forge, between her and any hope of safety. Then Quentin was there, appearing from the direction of the carpenter's shop like an avenging spirit. He put himself between Petra and the mob, his arms spread wide, his face set in an expression of fury that Petra had never seen on him before. "Enough!" he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos with surprising power. "The next person who throws a stone answers to me." The crowd hesitated, shocked into momentary stillness. Quentin used the pause to back toward Petra, never taking his eyes off the mob. When he reached her, he took her hand in his, squeezing it once in reassurance before turning his attention back to his neighbors. "This woman is under my protection," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "She has worked in my forge for 2 weeks without incident, without harm to anyone. She was bringing lunch to my apprentice because I asked her to. If you have a problem with her presence, you take it up with me, not with stones and violence." A man Petra recognized as the settlement's miller pushed to the front of the crowd. "She is an orc, Yardley. They killed my brother in the border raids 5 years back. They are all murderers and thieves, and you are a fool for harboring one." "I am sorry for your loss," Quentin said, and his voice gentled fractionally. "Truly, I am. But Petra is not responsible for your brother's death any more than you are responsible for the crimes of every human who ever lived. She was exiled from her clan for saving a human child's life. Does that sound like a murderer to you?" A murmur ran through the crowd, confusion mixing with the anger. The miller's face worked as he struggled with Quentin's words. "Even so," he said finally, "it is not natural, her being here. It is not safe." "She has been here for 2 weeks," Quentin repeated. "In that time, what harm has she done? What crime has she committed other than existing?" No one had an answer for that. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse, people drifting away in 2s and 3s, though Petra could feel their eyes on her, could sense their continued distrust. Thomas had reached them by now, his face still pale, and he positioned himself on Petra's other side as if to offer his own protection. Quentin did not release Petra's hand until they were back at the forge with the door firmly shut behind them. Even then, he held on for a moment longer, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that might have been unconscious. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his gray eyes searching her face. "Only a bruise," Petra managed, though she was shaking all over from the surge of fear and adrenaline. "Quentin, I should not have gone to the market. I knew better. I am sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," Quentin said fiercely. "You were doing me a favor and you were attacked for it. If anyone should apologize, it is those people out there who let old hatreds blind them to basic decency." Thomas nodded vigorously. "Master Quentin is right. What they did was wrong. My ma always says you judge people by their actions, not by what they look like, and you have never been anything but kind and hard-working." Petra felt the tears come again, and this time she did not try to stop them. She sank down onto the bench by the workbench and put her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that had been building for weeks. All the fear and loneliness and grief she had been holding at bay came pouring out in a flood, and she wept like she had not wept since the day of her exile. She felt Quentin sit down beside her, felt his hand rest tentatively on her shoulder. Thomas disappeared and returned a moment later with a cup of water and a clean rag, pressing both into her hands with awkward kindness. And somehow, surrounded by these two human males who had no reason to care about her but did anyway, Petra felt something in her heart begin to heal. When the tears finally subsided, she wiped her face with the rag and took a long drink of water. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "Both of you. I do not know what I did to deserve such kindness, but I am grateful for it." "You do not have to do anything to deserve basic human decency," Quentin said quietly. "And you do not have to earn the right to be treated with respect. Those things should be given freely to everyone, regardless of their race or origin." Thomas nodded again, though he looked less certain now, more thoughtful. "The adults are always talking about how different the orcs are, how dangerous, but you are not scary at all, Petra. You are just a person. Like us." "I am a person," Petra agreed softly. "Just like you, with hopes and fears, dreams and regrets. The fact that my skin is green and I have tusks does not change the essential truth of that." They sat in silence for a while, the three of them, while the fire crackled in the forge and the afternoon light slanted through the high windows. Finally, Quentin stood and offered Petra his hand to help her up. "Come," he said. "Let us get back to work. I find that sometimes the best cure for a bad day is to create something useful with your own two hands." Petra took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, and when he smiled at her, she smiled back despite everything. Because he was right, there was something healing about work, about the steady rhythm of the bellows and the clang of hammer on anvil, about taking raw materials and shaping them into something new. The incident in the market square had consequences, though not the ones Petra expected. She assumed that the confrontation would further damage Quentin's reputation, would drive away even more customers. And certainly, there were some who made their disapproval known by taking their business elsewhere. But there were also others, people who had heard about Quentin's defense of Petra, who came to the forge specifically because they respected his stand. A widow named Margaret arrived with her son's broken plow blade and told Quentin that she admired a man who stood by his principles even when it was hard. A farmer named Daniel brought an order for new hinges and mentioned casually that he had always thought the hatred between humans and orcs was foolish, kept alive by people who benefited from the division. And slowly, cautiously, Petra found that not everyone in the settlement looked at her with hostility. Oh, there were still plenty who did, plenty who crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming or made signs against evil in her direction. But there were also those who nodded politely, who treated her like a person rather than a monster, who chose to see her actions rather than her appearance. It was not acceptance, not really, but it was a start. And for Petra, who had expected nothing but rejection from humans, it was more than she had dared hope for. As the weeks passed and spring deepened into early summer, the settlement seemed to reach an uneasy truce regarding Petra's presence. She was not welcomed, but she was tolerated, and that was enough. She continued to work at the forge, her skills growing under Quentin's patient instruction, and she found a fragile sort of happiness in the routine they had established. But she was also increasingly aware of her feelings for Quentin, feelings that had grown from gratitude into something deeper and more complicated. She watched him work with admiration that went beyond his skill as a smith, noticed the small kindnesses he showed to everyone who came to the forge, treasured the moments when his rare smile was directed at her. She found excuses to stand close to him, to work beside him, to brush against him in the cramped space of the forge, and she was almost certain he felt the same way. She caught him staring at her when he thought she was not looking, saw the way his expression softened when she laughed at something Thomas said, felt the electricity that sparked between them whenever they accidentally touched. But neither of them said anything, both trapped by the unspoken understanding that to acknowledge these feelings would be to invite pain and complication. The moment of truth came on a warm evening in late spring. Thomas had gone home for the day, and Quentin and Petra were finishing up the last tasks, banking the forge fire and tidying the workspace. They moved around each other with the ease of long practice, and when they finally finished, Quentin did not immediately head upstairs to his room as he usually did. Instead, he stood by the open door of the forge, looking out at the twilight settling over the settlement. Petra joined him, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and together they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "I have been thinking," Quentin said finally, his voice quiet, "about the future, about what comes next." Petra's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her voice steady. "And what have you concluded?" "Thomas is progressing well in his training. In another year or two, he will be ready to strike out on his own, maybe start a forge in one of the new settlements further west. When that happens, I will need to find another apprentice, or—" He trailed off, then turned to face her fully. "Or I could take on a partner, someone who already knows the work, who has proven themselves reliable and skilled, someone I trust." Petra could barely breathe. "A partner." "A full partner in the business," Quentin clarified. "An equal share in the profits and the decisions. Your name alongside mine on the sign outside." He paused, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim light. "If you wanted that. If you wanted to stay permanently, instead of just until you could afford to move on to the southern settlements." Petra's mind was racing. What Quentin was offering was more than she had ever dared imagine, not just continued employment, but a true place in his life, a future that stretched beyond the next week or month. But she also knew that accepting would mean giving up on other dreams, on the possibility of finding a place where she truly belonged, where she did not have to constantly prove her worth and defend her existence. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you tie yourself to me like that? You have seen how the settlement reacts to my presence. Imagine how much worse it would be if I were your partner, if my name were on the sign next to yours. You would be declaring yourself permanently allied with an orc. Your reputation, your business, your entire life would be affected." Quentin stepped closer, close enough that Petra had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact. "I know," he said simply. And I have thought about it carefully, Petra. I have weighed the costs and the benefits. And what I have concluded is that I do not care what the narrow-minded fools in this settlement think. You are the best thing that has happened to this forge, to this business, and to—" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "And to me. You are the best thing that has happened to me." Petra's breath caught in her throat. "Quentin, I am not asking you to decide right now," he said quickly. "I know this is sudden, and I know you need time to think about what you want, but I needed you to know that the option is there. That if you want to stay, if you want to build something here with me, I would welcome it with everything I am." There was something in his voice, in the way he was looking at her, that made Petra think he was talking about more than just a business partnership. And before she could think better of it, before caution could reassert itself, she reached up and cupped his face in her hand, feeling the scratch of stubble against her palm. "And if I wanted more than a partnership," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I wanted something that goes beyond business arrangements and profit shares, what then?" Quentin's eyes widened fractionally, and then he was covering her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "Then I would tell you that I have wanted that too, since the day you proved you could keep a steady temperature in the forge, maybe even before that. I would tell you that I dream about you at night, that I find excuses to stand close to you during the day, that the thought of you leaving makes me feel hollow inside." Petra felt like she might burst from the joy and terror swirling in her chest. "This is madness," she said, but she was smiling even as she said it. "Humans and orcs do not. People will never accept it. They will say terrible things. They may even try to drive you out." "Let them try," Quentin said fiercely. "I am done caring what other people think. I am done letting old prejudices dictate how I live my life. Petra, you are brave and kind and strong, and you make me want to be better than I am. If people cannot see that, if they want to judge us for finding something good in this world, then that is their loss, not ours." Petra laughed, a sound that was half sob, and then she was pulling him down toward her even as he was leaning in, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home. It was awkward at first, complicated by the difference in their anatomy, by her tusks and his inexperience with kissing someone who had them. But they figured it out, adjusting and learning and laughing breathlessly against each other's mouths. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. Quentin rested his forehead against hers, his hands coming up to frame her face with surprising gentleness. "So is that a yes?" he asked. "To the partnership and everything that goes with it?" "Yes," Petra said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it, to the business and the future and you, always yes to you." They stood there in the doorway of the forge, wrapped in each other's arms while the night deepened around them, and Petra felt a peace settle over her that she had not known since before her exile. She had thought that being cast out from her clan meant she would never belong anywhere again, would always be adrift and alone. But she had been wrong. Belonging was not about who shared your blood or your species. It was about who saw you for who you truly were and chose to stand beside you anyway. The following morning, Petra woke in her small room with a smile on her face and her heart lighter than it had been in months. She could hear Quentin moving around downstairs, and when she descended, she found him at the forge with an expression that matched her own joy mixed with wonder, as if he too could not quite believe what had happened between them. Thomas arrived shortly after, and if he noticed anything different about the way Quentin and Petra looked at each other, he was kind enough not to mention it. The three of them fell into their usual work routine, but Petra found herself catching Quentin's eye across the forge, sharing small smiles that made her chest feel warm. It was during the afternoon, when Thomas had run an errand to deliver a repaired kettle, that Quentin pulled Petra aside. "I know we talked about a partnership," he said, "but I have been thinking about the practical aspects. If we are going to do this properly, if we are going to make this official, we should draw up a contract. Something that spells out the terms and protects both of us." Petra nodded slowly. "That makes sense, though I confess I do not know much about human legal customs." "Neither do I, really," Quentin admitted with a wry smile. "But there is a magistrate in the next settlement over, a woman named Constance who handles contracts and property disputes. I could ride over there tomorrow and ask her to draw something up, unless—" He hesitated, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Unless you think it is too soon, if you need more time to be sure." Petra took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I am sure," she said firmly. "I have never been more sure of anything. Let us make it official. Let us build something together that lasts." The trip to see Magistrate Constance took most of the following day. Quentin left early in the morning on the Forge's old mare, promising to be back by evening. Petra spent the day working with Thomas, who was finally beginning to develop something approaching rhythm on the Bellows, and trying not to let her nerves get the better of her. She knew that drawing up a contract was a practical step, a necessary one if she and Quentin were going to be true partners. But it also felt momentous, like she was committing to a path from which there would be no easy turning back. Not that she wanted to turn back, she wanted this, wanted him, wanted the future they were beginning to build together. But the weight of it all was daunting nonetheless. Quentin returned just as the sun was setting, and Petra knew immediately from his expression that something was wrong. He dismounted from the mare with movements that seemed heavy, weighed down, and when he entered the forge he did not meet her eyes. "What happened?" Petra asked, her stomach sinking. Quentin ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing on end. "I spoke to Magistrate Constance. She listened to what I wanted, and then she explained the law to me. Petra, there is no provision in our legal code for partnerships between humans and orcs. The law does not recognize orcs as having the same rights as humans, which means that any contract we drew up would not be enforceable. You would have no legal protection, no guarantee of ownership or profit share. Everything would still be in my name, and you would be entirely dependent on my good faith." Petra felt like she had been struck. "Oh, that is not the worst of it," Quentin continued, his voice rough with emotion. "The magistrate also warned me that if I tried to circumvent the law, if I made you a partner in anything but name only, I could face charges. Apparently, there is a statute about giving aid and comfort to enemy races that could be interpreted to include business partnerships. I could be fined, or even lose the forge entirely." The room seemed to tilt around Petra. She sat down heavily on the bench, her mind racing. Of course there would be laws against what they were trying to do. Of course the system would be designed to keep humans and orcs separate, to maintain the divisions that served those in power. She had been naive to think otherwise, to believe that their personal feelings could overcome the structural barriers between their peoples. "So we cannot do it," she said flatly. "We cannot be partners, not really." "Not under the law," Quentin agreed. He knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his. "But Petra, listen to me. I do not care about the law, I do not care about contracts or official recognition. As far as I am concerned, you are my partner in every way that matters. We will split the profits equally, we will make decisions together, and your voice will carry the same weight as mine. The fact that some magistrate says the law does not recognize it changes nothing about what I feel or what I want." Petra shook her head, though she did not pull her hands away. "It changes everything, Quentin. Without legal protection, I am vulnerable. If something happened to you, if you became sick or injured, I would have no claim to the business we built together. And you would be vulnerable too if someone accused you of breaking that statute. You could lose everything because of me. We cannot build a life together on such an unstable foundation." "Then what are you saying?" Quentin asked, his voice tight with pain. "That we should just give up? That because the law is unjust, we should surrender to it?" "I am saying that we need to be realistic," Petra said gently. "I am saying that love alone is not enough to overcome the barriers between us. I wish it were different. I wish we lived in a world where my race did not matter, where we could simply be two people who care about each other building a life together. But we do not live in that world, Quentin. We live in this one with all its prejudice and injustice, and we have to deal with the reality of that." Quentin stood abruptly, pacing away from her. "So what do you want to do? Leave, go south after all, and try to find somewhere more accepting?" "Maybe," Petra admitted. "Or maybe we both go. We could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere the laws are different, somewhere no one knows us or cares about the color of my skin." Quentin stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You would want me to give up the forge, to abandon everything my father built, everything I have worked for?" "No," Petra said quickly. "No, I would never ask that of you. The forge is your legacy, your livelihood. I would never expect you to give that up for me." She stood and crossed to him, placing her hand on his chest over his heart. "But I also cannot ask you to risk everything for a relationship the law says should not exist. We are at an impasse, Quentin, and I do not know how to resolve it." They stood there in silence, the weight of the impossible situation pressing down on them. Petra could feel the beat of Quentin's heart under her palm, steady and strong, and she wanted nothing more than to tell him they would find a way, that love could conquer all. But she had learned the hard way that good intentions and strong feelings were not enough to change the world. The solution, when it came from an unexpected source. Thomas arrived the next morning with news that his uncle, a merchant who traveled frequently between the frontier settlements and the larger cities to the east, had just returned from a journey. And he had brought with him stories about a place far to the west, beyond the settled territories, where a new community was forming. "My uncle says it is mostly people who did not fit in the regular settlements," Thomas explained excitedly. "Humans who married elves, dwarves who chose to work in human forges, even some orcs who left their clans. They are building a place where race does not matter as much, where the old laws and prejudices do not hold as much power." Petra and Quentin exchanged glances, and Petra saw hope flicker in his gray eyes. "How far west?" Quentin asked. 3 weeks' journey, maybe a month depending on the weather and the roads. It is right on the edge of the wilderness, so it is dangerous. But my uncle says the people there are good folk, and they welcome anyone willing to work hard and treat others with respect." After Thomas left for the day, Petra and Quentin stayed up late talking, weighing the possibilities. Starting over in a new place would be a risk, no question. They would be leaving behind everything familiar, venturing into unknown territory with no guarantee of success. But it would also give them a chance that they could not have here, a chance to be true partners, to build something together without constantly looking over their shoulders for disapproval or legal repercussions. "I want to do it," Quentin said finally, his voice firm with decision. "I want to go west with you and start fresh. We can take what tools and supplies we can carry, and we can build a new forge in this settlement," Thomas's uncle described. "It will be hard work, and there will be challenges, but at least we will be facing them together as equals." Petra felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you certain? You would truly give up everything here, everything you have built, to go into the wilderness with me?" "I am not giving up anything," Quentin said, pulling her into his arms. "I am choosing something better. I am choosing you, and a future where we do not have to hide what we are to each other. That is not a sacrifice, Petra. That is the easiest decision I have ever made." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the journey. Quentin sold the forge building to a blacksmith from a neighboring settlement who had been looking to expand his business. It hurt to let go of his father's legacy, but he took comfort in knowing the forge would continue to serve the community. He kept the best of his tools and sold or gave away the rest, using the proceeds to purchase a sturdy wagon and 2 horses to pull it. Petra helped him pack, carefully wrapping each tool and organizing the supplies they would need for the journey and for setting up a new forge once they arrived. Thomas cried when they told him they were leaving, but he also understood why they had to go. On their last day, he gave Petra an awkward hug and made her promise to send word once they were settled, so he would know they were safe. The settlement's reaction to their departure was mixed. Some people were openly relieved to see the orc leaving, and they made no effort to hide their satisfaction. But others, like the widow Margaret and the farmer Daniel, came to wish them well and to thank Quentin for his years of service to the community. A few even brought gifts for the journey: food, blankets, a well-made knife that Margaret said had belonged to her late husband. On the morning they were set to leave, Petra stood in the empty forge one last time, looking around at the space that had become her home. This was where she had found refuge from the storm, where she had learned to trust again, where she had fallen in love. It was bittersweet to leave it, but she was not sad, because she was not leaving alone, and the future that waited for them in the west shone bright with possibility. Quentin came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Ready?" he asked softly. Petra covered his hands with her own and leaned back into his embrace. "Ready," she confirmed. The journey west was long and arduous, just as they had expected. They traveled through forests and across rivers, skirted mountains and traversed plains, always pushing toward the setting sun. The wagon was heavy with their supplies, and there were days when the roads were so poor that they had to stop and repair broken wheels or rest the horses. They encountered storms that soaked them to the skin and heat waves that left them parched and exhausted. But there were good days too, days when the sun shone warm and bright, when they found clear streams to refill their water barrels and meadows where the horses could graze. They talked for hours as they traveled, sharing stories and dreams, planning the forge they would build and the life they would create. At night, they would make camp and sit by the fire, and Quentin would play a battered wooden flute he had brought along, coaxing simple melodies from it while Petra listened with her eyes closed. And sometimes, when the fire had burned down to embers and the stars wheeled overhead, they would lie together in the wagon bed, wrapped in blankets, and kiss until they were breathless. They took things slowly, both aware that they were navigating new territory, learning each other's bodies and boundaries. But there was joy in that learning, pleasure in each small discovery, and Petra had never felt so cherished, so wanted as she did in Quentin's arms. 3.5 weeks into their journey, they began to see signs that they were approaching the settlement Thomas's uncle had described. The forest they were traveling through showed evidence of recent clearing, with stumps marking where trees had been felled and paths that had been deliberately widened. Then they crested a hill and saw it spread out below them, a collection of buildings in various stages of construction, scattered across a broad valley with a river running through it. It was smaller than Petra had imagined, perhaps only 30 or 40 structures in total, but it buzzed with activity. She could see people moving between the buildings, hear the distant sound of hammering and sawing, smell the smoke from multiple cooking fires. And as they drew closer, she realized that Thomas's uncle had not exaggerated. The people she saw were a mix of races and backgrounds that would have been impossible in the settlements they had left behind. There was a human woman working side by side with an elf man to raise the frame of a new building. A dwarf was arguing amiably with an orc over the best way to dig a well. Children of various species chased each other through the muddy streets, their laughter ringing out clear and bright. They found the settlement's informal leader, a weathered human woman named Eliza Quinton, outside what looked like a general store and trading post. She listened to their story with sharp, intelligent eyes, nodding occasionally as Quentin explained about the forge and their skills. "We could use a good blacksmith," Eliza said when he finished. "Right now, anyone who needs metalwork has to travel 2 days to the nearest settlement or make do with what they can cobble together themselves. If you are willing to set up here, I can show you a plot of land down by the river that would be perfect for a forge. Good access to water, and far enough from the other buildings that the noise and smoke would not bother anyone." "What about laws?" Petra asked hesitantly. "Are there restrictions on who can own property or enter into partnerships?" Eliza's smile was sharp. "Out here, we make our own laws within reason. As long as you are not hurting anyone or stealing from your neighbors, we do not much care about the regulations that govern the eastern settlements. If you want to be partners, if you want to put both your names on the deed to your property, no one here is going to stop you." Petra felt something tight in her chest finally relax. "Then yes," she said, looking at Quentin and seeing her own hope reflected in his eyes. "Yes, we would like to build our forge here." The plot of land Eliza showed them was everything she had promised and more. It sat on a gentle slope overlooking the river, with plenty of space for a forge building and a house, and easy access to both the water and the main path through the settlement. They spent their first week in the new settlement living in the wagon while they began construction, and Petra was overwhelmed by the willingness of their new neighbors to help. The elf man, whose name was Lyrian, offered to help them fell the trees they would need for the buildings. The orc who had been arguing about the well, a gruff but kind male named Goroth, brought his sons to help dig the foundation. The dwarf, who introduced herself as Helda, shared her expertise in stonework to help them build the forge itself, showing them how to construct a chimney that would draw properly and a hearth that would withstand the intense heat. Within a month, they had the basic structure of the forge complete, with the house beginning to take shape beside it. Quentin and Petra worked from dawn until dusk every day and fell into their bedrolls each night exhausted but satisfied. They were building something real, something that belonged to both of them equally, and every stone they laid and every beam they raised felt like a statement of defiance against a world that said they could not be together. The forge opened for business on a crisp autumn morning, 3 months after they had first arrived in the settlement. Quentin had painted a sign to hang over the door, and when Petra saw what he had written on it, she burst into tears. "Yardley and Ashford Forge," it read. "Fine metalwork and repairs, partners in craft and life." Their first customer was Helda the dwarf, who brought them an order for a set of specialized tools she needed for her stonework. She examined the forge with a critical eye, tested the heat of the fire, and then nodded in approval. "You have done good work here," she said. "This is a proper forge built to last. I will spread the word that Yardley and Ashford can be trusted to deliver quality." And spread the word she did. Within weeks, they had more orders than they could easily handle, everything from horseshoes to decorative ironwork, from cooking pots to specialized farming implements. The settlement was growing rapidly, and with that growth came an endless need for the products a smith could provide. Petra and Quentin fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side with the partnership that had been forged in Quentin's old smithy and tempered through their journey west. Petra's skills continued to grow under Quentin's patient teaching, and soon she was handling projects on her own, freeing Quentin to focus on the more complex commissions. They made friends in the settlement, real friends who saw them as simply Petra and Quentin rather than as an orc and a human. They were invited to community gatherings, asked to help with building projects, included in the daily life of the settlement in ways that Petra had never experienced before. For the first time since her exile, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. As winter approached, bringing with it the first snows, Quentin surprised Petra by asking her to take a walk with him up to the hill overlooking the settlement. They stood together looking down at the lights beginning to glow in the windows as dusk fell, at the smoke rising from chimneys, at the evidence of the community they had become part of. "I have been thinking," Quentin said, taking Petra's hand in his, "about what comes next. We have built the forge, established the business, created a home here, and I find myself wanting to make it all official in a way that goes beyond business partnerships." Petra's heart began to race, though she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean?" Quentin turned to face her fully, and even in the fading light she could see the nervousness and hope in his eyes. "I mean that I want to marry you, Petra Ashford. I want to stand before our friends and neighbors and pledge my life to yours. I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my days and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build not just a forge with you, but a family, a future, everything that two people who love each other can build together." He pulled something from his pocket, and Petra saw that it was a ring, simple but beautiful, wrought from iron and inlaid with a band of copper that glowed warm in the twilight. "I made this for you," he said. "If you will have it, if you will have me." Petra could not speak through the tears streaming down her face, so she simply nodded, holding out her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm from his pocket and from the love that had shaped it. And when he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, she kissed him back with all the joy and gratitude and love that filled her heart to bursting. They were married 3 weeks later, on a cold, clear day when the snow lay thick on the ground and the sky was a brilliant blue. Eliza officiated, reading from a book of ceremonies that had been cobbled together from the various traditions of the settlement's diverse population. Petra wore a dress that held his wife had helped her make, deep green wool with copper embroidery at the cuffs and collar. Quentin wore his finest shirt and trousers, with a vest Petra had given him as a wedding gift, made from leather she had worked herself. Their friends and neighbors gathered to witness the ceremony, filling the small common building that served as the settlement's meeting hall. Goroth and his family were there, along with Lyrian and his human partner. Helda stood up as one of Quentin's witnesses, and to Petra's surprise and delight, Thomas had made the long journey from the east to attend, nearly a man now at 16, taller and broader than she remembered. When Eliza pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Quentin kissed Petra thoroughly, to more cheers and a few good-natured catcalls, and Petra laughed with pure happiness against his lips. The celebration that followed went late into the night, with food and music and dancing. Petra found herself pulled into a circle of women who wanted to toast the bride, then into a group of men who wanted to offer Quentin advice that ranged from sincere to comically terrible. She danced with Quentin, with Thomas, with Goroth, who moved with surprising grace for such a large orc, with Lyrian, who taught her an elven dance that left her dizzy and laughing. And when they finally escaped to their own house, to the bedroom they had built together with their own hands, Quentin carried her over the threshold in the human tradition, and she carried him over in the orc tradition of lifting one's partner to show you were strong enough to protect them. They laughed at the absurdity of their competing customs, And then the laughter faded into something deeper and more serious as they came together with a tenderness and passion that left them both shaking. Afterward, lying in their bed with Quentin's arms wrapped around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Petra thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had been exiled from her clan, cast out for showing mercy to a human child. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything, like she was losing the only world she had ever known. But it had not been the end. It had been a beginning. Because that exile had led her through the storm to Quentin's forge, and working the Bellows had led to partnership, and partnership had led to love, and love had led them here, to this new settlement where they could build a life together without shame or hiding. "What are you thinking about?" Quentin murmured sleepily, his breath warm against her hair. "I am thinking," Petra said softly, "that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things. I am thinking that I would go through my exile again, would walk through 100 storms, if it meant ending up here with you." Quentin hugged her tighter, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am thinking the same thing. And I am thinking about the future, about the forge we will grow, the family we might have someday, the life we will build together year by year. I am thinking that I am the luckiest man alive." "The luckiest human married to the luckiest orc," Petra corrected with a smile. "Exactly," Quentin agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "The luckiest us." Spring came again, bringing with it new growth and new beginnings. The settlement continued to expand, with new families arriving weekly, drawn by word of a place where old prejudices mattered less than hard work and good character. The forge prospered, its reputation spreading to the surrounding areas, bringing commissions from further and further afield. And in the early summer, Petra discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror, but Quentin's ecstatic reaction soothed her fears. They spent hours talking about what kind of parents they wanted to be, what values they would teach their child, how they would prepare them for a world that might not always be kind to someone who was half human and half orc. But they would face those challenges together, just as they had faced everything else. And their child would grow up in a home filled with love, in a community that valued people for who they were rather than what they were, with parents who would teach them that mercy and kindness were never weaknesses, that building bridges was better than maintaining walls. Their daughter was born in the late autumn, small but healthy, with Quentin's gray eyes and Petra's green skin, with tiny nubs that might become tusks and perfectly shaped pointed ears. They named her Rose, because Petra said she was beautiful and perfect and had bloomed from the love they had planted together, and Quentin agreed that it suited her exactly. The settlement celebrated the birth of Rose Yardley Ashford with the same enthusiasm they brought to all their gatherings, and Petra was overwhelmed by the outpouring of gifts and support from their friends and neighbors. Helda carved a beautiful cradle from oak. Lyrian's partner wove tiny blankets soft as clouds. Goroth's wife brought a steady stream of meals in the weeks after the birth, making sure Petra had time to rest and recover. On a warm spring evening when Rose was 6 months old and beginning to laugh at everything her parents did, Petra stood at the door of the forge watching Quentin work while their daughter dozed against her shoulder. She thought about the girl she had been when she first took refuge in a smithy from the rain, frightened and alone and certain she would never belong anywhere again. That girl could never have imagined this future, could never have dreamed that working the Bellows would lead to a partnership that became a marriage that became a family. Could never have known that the storm she was fleeing was actually driving her toward home, toward the place and the person she was always meant to find. Quentin looked up from his work and saw her watching. He set down his hammer and crossed to her, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead and another on Rose's downy hair. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night, the question that had become a comfortable ritual between them. Petra smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I am thinking about storms and shelters and the strange paths that lead us to where we are meant to be. I am thinking about second chances and new beginnings. I am thinking that I am exactly where I belong." "We all are," Quentin said softly, gathering his wife and daughter into his arms. "We all are." And there, in the doorway of the forge they had built together, with the sounds of their thriving settlement rising around them and their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, Petra and Quentin stood wrapped in each other's embrace and looked toward a future bright with promise and possibility. A future they would face together, always together, for all the years to come.